Okay. I talked about a couple of these things already as we move towards the end of Jackson's reign. If you watch the video on Friday that I put up, you talk a little bit about, or I talked a little bit about the two major things that end up at the end of Jackson's presidency. In fact, let's kind of go back and review those, if I can find them on here, and we'll talk a little bit about them. Okay. The just kind of review a little bit. Where am I? All right. A couple things that are going to continue to haunt us about Jackson's administration. One is nullification. Okay. The roots of nullification go back to really they go back to Jefferson's and Madison's Virginia and Kentucky resolves, which said that states had the power to declare acts of Congress, laws passed by Congress, signed by the president, unconstitutional. Now, recently we talked about how that power had been taken over a little bit by the Supreme Court after the Marbury versus Madison case. But in this case, in the nullification case, South Carolina believed that the tariff of 1828 was unconstitutional. John C. Calhoun had written his South Carolina Exposition and Protest in 1828, basically saying that this Constitution is a compact between the states, and states have the right, this is where we get that term, states' rights. States have the right to declare tariffs unconstitutional, laws unconstitutional, and Calhoun made the argument that the tariff only punished one particular part of the nation and benefited only one particular part of the nation, and therefore it should be unconstitutional. South Carolina pushes this all the way to the brink, forcing Jackson essentially to push through Congress a bill that said that if South Carolina nullified the tariff, that the federal government would intervene. Okay? And so when the nullification issue sort of got going, okay, and in 1832, when Congress was trying to push through a new tariff to lower the tariff, but also to kind of appease South Carolina said it doesn't go far enough. We're going to nullify it. And that's when Jackson responded with that force bill. This case, okay, South Carolina eventually backs down because Henry Clay pushes through a compromise tariff that would push the tariff lower over the next 10 years, and South Carolina accepted it. And so we don't really have to deal with this issue of what would have happened. Jackson would have intervened. Okay, Jackson would have sent troops into South Carolina, forcing them to obey the tariff, and we might have had a civil war in 1832 if South Carolina had not backed down. Jackson's use of presidential power is something that we haven't seen up to this point. This is a great example. Okay, Jackson is a very powerful president and will use, he's a military guy, and he will use it to, he's used to using power like this, okay? He will be the first president to veto really anything, okay? And he will veto one of Henry Clay's attempts to expand the national road, and he argues that it only applies to the state, and so federal money shouldn't be used for it, and so he vetoes it. No president had really done that up to that point. Jackson is very much criticized for his Native American policy, which he will essentially push through Congress the Indian Removal Act in 1830 to remove the 5 civilized tribes from east of the Mississippi to the west of the Mississippi, or to Oklahoma, essentially. Even though the Supreme Court declared that some of these Native American groups had particular rights, there were 2 Supreme Court cases that John Marshall presided over that essentially said the Cherokee were an independent nation almost, a domestic dependent nation. and that Georgia had no right to their land. Okay? But Jackson runs over the Supreme Court and removes them anyway. Okay? And that is that's when we start talking about people that are able to do that. That's a very powerful president. Jackson will push through the Indian Removal Act, which begins the removal of those 5 civilized tribes: the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Seminole. Now, this bleeds over into what we're going to talk about today, because this doesn't get finished under Jackson's administration. It begins, but it doesn't get finished. Okay? For example, that red line that you see up there is the Trail of Tears, the removal of the Cherokee and some of the northern tribes through Tennessee into Kentucky and then across over into Oklahoma. Okay, Trail of Tears doesn't really get going until Martin Van Buren's administration. Okay, so it is the origins of it are in Jackson's administration, but it doesn't really get going until Van Buren's. But everybody blames it on Jackson anyway, and they should. Okay, the bank war I talked about in the lecture over on Friday. Okay, make sure that you go back and look at that. But in this case, you can see how Jackson really decides that the Bank of the United States is unconstitutional and decides to kill it. And he will veto the attempt to recharter the bank, and then he will kill it by removing all of the nation's funds out of the bank and eventually driving it into bankruptcy. The problem with that, if you didn't get that from the lecture, is that he invested all of this money into state banks, Jackson's so-called pet banks. Okay, and these pet banks were state banks scattered throughout the nation that Jackson decided to deposit federal monies into. And I told you guys in the lecture, it's akin to you winning the lottery. So you win $100 million in the lottery. Okay, after taxes, you decide to go to someone who is a professional money manager, and you give that money, you turn that money over to that person, and you say, make me money. And since that guy is a professional, what happens? Chances are they do okay. Okay? Now that's the smart thing to do. Okay? But then you get a wild hair and you don't think that that person is doing a good enough job, even though they are, okay, which is exactly what the Bank of the United States was doing. The Bank of the United States was doing a fine job, okay? But Jackson, feeling it's unconstitutional, decides to pull all of that money out and then to disperse it to 20 or so state banks, okay, pet banks. Would be like you taking your money out and going and giving your money to 20 of your friends and saying, go make me money with this. How's that going to turn out for you? Okay? You go and give $500,000 to 20 of your friends. Are they going to make any money for you? No, they're all going to be living in Costa Rica somewhere. They're hiding from you. Okay? You're not going to make any money. And this is the same problem. You turn over tons of money to banks that aren't prepared to handle it. They do terribly managing it, and it's going to lead to a depression, okay, as you can probably guess, okay. All right. We'll come back to this. In 1836, something's happening, and this is where we're going to kind of start. Jackson is not going to run for re-election in 1836, but he is going to handpick his successor, who is Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren is the sitting vice president. Van Buren has been a close ally of Jackson for several years, and so Jackson's the puppet master, okay? he essentially is going to handpick Van Buren and run Van Buren for president, and then probably try to tell Van Buren what he wants him to do. Okay, so it's something like that. But something has been brewing, and I pointed this out a little bit the last time, and I want you to kind of get this into your wheelhouse now because it's really coming. One of the things that starts to appear is a new political party. Okay, we're going to call them the Whigs. They are really the anti-Jackson party. They could be lots of different things. They could be Northerners, they could be Southerners, they could be Westerners. Okay. The one thing they have in common, though, is that they don't like Andrew Jackson. They don't like Andrew Jackson. They don't like his policies. And so, Martin Van Buren, really Jackson's handpicked successor, wins the election, but has to face a new political party that does relatively well. They had started to emerge in 1832. They were on the verge, really, of developing way back in 1832. Okay, see Clay's National Republicans right there. Okay, Clay and Daniel Webster had really almost created a third party against Jackson in 1832. And notice they got 49 electoral votes, nothing spectacular. But 4 years later, these groups, or these anti-Jackson groups, have coalesced into what's going to become the Whig Party. And like I told you guys, and like I kind of pointed out, I'm going to go back to this, okay, that the Whigs are anything that Jackson is for, the Whigs seem to be against. Look at the last few, okay? The Jacksonian Democrats want Indian removal. Okay, well, the Whigs oppose Indian removal. Okay, the Whigs support a national bank. The Jacksonians hate the national bank, kill it. Okay, so get the idea? Anything that really the Jacksonians are for, the Whigs are going to be against. And so you begin to see this political party, this new political party emerge. And when you add the Whig performance in 1836 together, they do okay for a new third party. They're going to get better, trust me, okay? Van Buren gets swept into office, though, and because of some of Jackson's economic policies, okay, a bad thing happens almost immediately after Van Buren takes office. Okay? In 1836, right before he went out of office, Jackson issued something called the Specie Circular. Okay? And essentially what it did, I mean, it's real simple. Okay? What Jackson said is that banks, they wanted to buy federal land once lands were surveyed and came open on the market, that if you wanted to buy federal land, you had to pay in gold and silver, what's called specie, okay? Gold and silver have a tangible value, okay? When you pull out a piece of paper and it says $1 on it, okay, you understand that that technically has value, right? But if you pull out an ounce of gold, you know that that has a tremendous amount of value, right? So gold coins, silver coins are specie, okay? And so what Jackson says is you have to pay for federal lands with gold or silver. The old way of doing it was using paper money. And pit banks had encouraged wild speculation in the land market. What's speculation? It's gambling, okay? you borrow money, you throw it into land purchases, you hope that that land becomes valuable, and if it does, you resell it, and you pay back your loan, and whatever is left over is profit. So I borrow $100,000, buy $100,000 worth of land on the market that I think is going to become really valuable. Okay? 3 weeks later, the railroad announces that it's going to go right through that land, and it offers to buy all that land from me for $200,000. I sell it, pay off my loan and interest, and I'm left with profit, right? The problem is it's gambling, and what happens if I don't buy valuable land? Then I can't pay back that loan. I'm broke, and the bank is out $100,000 that it loaned me, which sometimes drives the bank into bankruptcy. Okay. Now, what's Jackson trying to do? One, he's trying to end speculation, because speculation is bad. Okay? And he's right, but this is not the way to do it. Okay? And it shocks the system. So much so that it's going to drive the nation into a depression. Okay? A lot of it is because of Jackson, though. Okay? A lot of it is because of what he does here. Okay? And it leads to the Panic of 1837. Just as soon, really, as Martin Van Buren gets into office, the nation goes into a depression. Okay, land sales plummet, credit's not available, businesses began to fail. If businesses can't get loans, if businesses can't make payroll, they fail. So if your business fails, all of a sudden you're unemployed. You get the idea, right? And so the Panic of 1837 hits really almost as soon as Van Buren gets elected and gets into office. What a way to come into a presidency, okay? And it hits everyone, okay? All right. Now, Van Buren is elected in 1836, right as the Whig Party is being born, okay? So remember, they hate Andrew Jackson, okay? So they are a mixed mash of people that did not like Jackson, and they do okay, but they don't do, they certainly don't win the election, okay? Now, Martin Van Buren is fascinating in a lot of ways, okay? You already know that he's been Secretary of State, he's been Vice President, okay? He is very close to Andrew Jackson. He's a widower, so technically he's a bachelor. And he is from New York. English was actually his second language. He was born to Dutch parents. Okay? So he actually spoke Dutch before he spoke English. And he's the first president born under the American flag. Okay? You know what that means? When he was born, America was independent. Okay? And so he is one of the first presidents that is technically a natural-born citizen. Okay? His father had been a patriot, had fought during the Revolutionary War. Okay? But he is born after independence, after America has become a nation. He had been governor of New York, so he has a very good pedigree. Okay? And in many ways, he is one of the most adept people at politics that we've seen so far. He completely changed politics, getting Andrew Jackson elected. Okay? And essentially, he's overseen really the creation of really two new political parties in a lot of ways. Okay? All right. I told you guys, remember, the difference between the Whigs and the Democrats are pretty substantial, okay? In many ways, the Whigs should remind you of the old Federalists, okay? They are They get a lot of their support from industrial areas. Okay. They do tend to be wealthy and elite. Okay. But remember that they will oppose many of the things that Jackson was for. Okay. The Democrats, on the other hand, we've already talked about, were supported by the common people. Okay. They favored the spoils system, did not like big business, did not like monopoly. Okay. So there's a big difference between these two political parties. Okay. And we're going to have to deal with them. Trust me. Okay. I told you guys that one of the biggest problems of Van Buren's administration is the panic. And let's face it, Van Buren does not do a tremendous job at dealing with the panic. Mainly because of Andrew Jackson. Inside of the government, there was a movement to try to deal with the panic by lifting what Jackson had done in 1836, getting rid of the specie circular, okay, going back to allowing banks to buy land using paper money rather than gold and silver. It was felt that would loosen up credit and it would kickstart the economy. Jackson writes a letter to Van Buren and says, don't do it. You haven't given it time to work yet. Don't do it. So what do? They don't do it. Okay? Even though it could have potentially shortened the panic, the depression. Instead, what Van Buren is going to do is formalize the pet bank system into something called the independent treasury. All right, I want you to think about this, okay? Let's talk about the difference in kind of these two ideas. Under Henry Clay's American system, you had a bank, the Bank of the United States, okay? Who oversaw the Bank of the United States? Why do we call it the Bank of the United States? Who oversaw it? We did, the United States, right? The bank was overseen by the government and was tied to the government. Where did all the government's money go into? The bank, okay? So you had one centralized bank that held all of the nation's money overseen by the government. Well, that's about as centralized as you can get, right? The independent treasury system divorced the treasury from the government, okay? And essentially picked different banks, state banks, local banks, okay, and deposited federal money into those banks. Now, if you're a fan of diversification, okay, if you're a fan of getting rid of centralization, this is great, right? And you can make lots of arguments that this may be a better system. For example, you have it's the old if you have all of your eggs in one basket kind of thing. You have all of your money in one bank, then what? That bank fails, you're doomed, right? If you diversify, one bank may go down, but the other ones are still okay, all right? The problem is that all of those other banks need what? They need to be on the same page. They need oversight, right? They need to be made to do the right thing, okay? If they don't, then we can end up with a situation like what caused the Panic of 1837, okay? And so, when these banks in 1837 started to fail, remember, these are pet banks, these are state banks, right? Local banks. But what did they have in them? The federal government's money. So when they failed, not only did they fail me and you, who may have had our money in there, But what? They failed the government. Oops, well, that's not good, right? So this is what led to this is what led really to the panic kind of not only happening but also lingering. Okay, and so the Whigs take the lead in this, and of course they're going to make it a big political issue in 1840. Okay, look, you're not doing anything about the panic. Okay. And so when the Whigs are just burying Van Buren, all right, for his lack of doing anything about the panic and about the Depression, okay, finally he kind of comes up with this idea of separating government funds from private banks entirely, okay. And what he decided to do was, instead of putting it in state banks, it was to lock it up in vaults in some select large banks. Okay, so we'll just take it out of these little pet banks and we'll go and deposit it in vaults in big banks and leave it there. What good does that do? Okay, that makes, in some ways, it makes it even worse. Okay, let me give you an example. You take that $500,000 or whatever that you won, and you stick it in a vault. And it's going to sit there, okay? So 65 years later, you decide to give it to your kids, and what's in there? $500,000, right? If you take that $500,000 and you invest it wisely, okay, instead of locking it up in a vault, and you invest it wisely, you diversify, okay, then what happens? Your money will grow over time. Is it riskier? Yes. Okay. Is it wiser? Perhaps. Okay. Think about this. In 1989, when I graduated high school, if I had won that money and bought $500,000 worth of gold and stuck it in a vault, would I be richer today? Oh, yeah. Why? Because gold has gained value, okay? And so the gold market has gone up, and so yes, I would have gained a ton of money, okay? Does that always happen? No. But if you diversify, okay, but here's the deal, okay? You chunk it into a vault, it doesn't help anybody, okay? So these banks get chosen to hold like these huge amounts of government money, but they can't touch them. It's like putting it in a safe deposit box and it just sits there, gathering dust, okay? Well, the independent treasury system is going to last for a few years, but it's going to eventually be repealed. We'll come back to it when you guys take the second part of this class, okay? You'll come back to this idea, okay? And it really, in some ways, is part of our nation's economy today. We have the Federal Reserve System, okay, which has these different regional banks that are out there that are caretakers of the government's money. All right. A couple of things happened during Van Buren's administration that you ought to know about, okay? Some foreign policy issues, okay, that happened. One is Texas independence, okay? American citizens for years have been crossing over and settling in Texas. So there is a significant American presence in what is today Texas. Except Texas is part of Mexico. Okay? In 1821, Mexico had gotten its independence, had declared its independence, and had won its independence from Spain. And so Mexico is an independent nation. But it had allowed Americans to cross over and to settle in parts of what is today Texas farming, settling there. Unfortunately, many of these Texans don't follow the rules. What was one of the things that they were not allowed to bring in? Take a wild guess. Slaves. Okay? And so they had begun to violate the rules. Some of them have. Mexico decides, as you get to the 1830s or so, that since these Americans, some of them aren't obeying the rules, and really, Mexico had become much more nationalistic by this time, especially under the dictator that emerges, Santa Anna, that they were going to get tossed out. Okay? And so this group of people that were living in what is today Texas, okay? So this area kind of right here, okay? So there are actually several kind of American settlements in Texas. Okay, this is Stephen F. Austin's colony right here. Okay, Edwards' colony is up there. Okay, and so what Mexico decides to do is to boot them out. Well, Texas says no way, and the Texicans and Tejanos, okay, the Mexicans, Mexican people that supported Texas independence, all right, will declare their independence in 1836. So, led by guys like Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin, Texas declares its independence in 1836, and they want to break away from Mexico. Now, one of the things they pretty quickly want also is what? The United States to come and help them. Do they? No. So when Texas declares its independence, Van Buren does not recognize Texas's independence. So Texas is really on its own. There are a lot of people that actually go to Texas to help the Texans fight. Okay? There are really a lot of Americans who kind of slip across the border and volunteer to help the Texans fight. Okay? Of course, the most famous battle takes place at the Alamo. Okay? Go back to the map here. Okay? You guys can kind of see what happened. The Mexican army will push this way, heading towards here. Okay? So you get this sort of retreat headed back here. Okay? So then you guys can kind of see how the Mexicans push this way, all right, and they are on the verge, really, of victory until they will be defeated right here at San Jacinto in 1836. Mexico loses this major battle, but they do really cause some severe damage. The Alamo, for example, was a kind of a last-ditch, last stand where David Crockett dies. Okay, you all have heard of David Crockett. But the defeat at the Alamo turns into a rallying cry for the Texans, and of course, like I told you, they fight and eventually win in 1836 at San Jacinto. And so Texas becomes an independent republic. Okay? So by 1836, this area essentially becomes an independent republic, the Republic of Texas. What they immediately want the United States to do is to do what? Recognize them, annex them. They want to become part of the United States, right? Van Buren will not do it. Why? He felt like if we did, we would end up going to war with Mexico. Is he right? Well, probably. Okay? And so Van Buren will not recognize Texas independence. So Texas is going to remain a republic for the next few years until it will eventually be recognized and eventually annexed. But trust me, the situation here is pretty hot, okay? And a war is brewing. We just haven't gotten there yet, okay? So all this happens on Van Buren's watch. Texas declares and wins its independence under Van Buren or while Van Buren is in office, but he refuses really to do anything about it. We almost go to war also in, of all places, Maine. Okay? All right. The situation between the United States and Canada has always been iffy. Okay? But to make matters worse, Canadians at this time, during Martin Van Buren's administration in 1836, all right, they were pushing for their own kind of independence from Britain. And so there was a lot of kind of iffy things going on in this area. All right, to set this up, you got to kind of understand what's going on here, okay? We believed that the border of Maine was way up there, okay?
Where the black is,
No.
where the red.
Where the green is, okay? So we believed that all of that green area up there was actually ours, okay? Canada, Great Britain, all right, believed that the border was actually down here. So that would have meant that the border would have been right in here, okay? Who's right? Well, nobody really knows, okay? The problem is that there were several incidents where this kind of almost led to a state declaring war on Canada, of all places, okay? Canadian lumberjacks were booted out of that area in the Aroostook Valley. Go back to the map. See the Aroostook River right here? Okay. The Canadian lumberjacks are booted out of that area by Maine. And they say, you can't do that. There were a couple of ships, boats, that were attacked and burned. The Caroline incident is one of them. So there's a kind of growing hostility, if you will, between the Mainers and the Canadians. Okay? And we almost go to war. What would have been the Aroostook War. Okay? It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. But tensions remain high. Now, a couple of years later, I'll go back to that map. A couple of years later, under Tyler's administration, Daniel Webster, who becomes the Secretary of State, will negotiate a treaty between us and Great Britain that settles that boundary, and that is that red line that you see up there. So we eventually kind of split the difference, and the main boundary is set on that red line that you see up there, what becomes known as the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. But it almost caused a war. Again, Van Buren does not think that we should go to war, and nothing really happens. Now, a couple other things. Remember, the Trail of Tears is going on. He catches a lot of flack about that. Okay? So Van Buren's presidency really is just hammered by lots of different things. His inability to solve the panic, all of these things that he can be criticized for. And so you can kind of guess that he is not going to do well in the election of 1840. A lot of new voters coming into the nation started calling him Van Ruin, okay, Martin Van Ruin. So you could probably guess that he is not going to do very well. The Whigs choose William Henry Harrison. The Whigs choose William Henry Harrison, who is the former governor of of Indiana, the former territorial governor of Indiana, who defeated the Native Americans at the Battle of Tippecanoe. Harrison will choose, or the party will choose, the Whigs will choose John Tyler to run with him, giving us the famous Tippecanoe and Tyler 2 campaign slogan. Tyler is useless. I really think sometimes that Tyler was chosen because he didn't have any enemies. The reason he didn't have any enemies is because he was so blah. Okay? They thought about running Clay. They thought about running Webster. Okay? But Tyler is maybe able to get more votes along with Harrison than Webster or Clay would have been able to get. They run a great campaign. The Whigs sort of invent this myth that Harrison grew up in a log cabin, became this great Indian fighter. Okay, at many of his campaign events, there was a lot of hard cider that was served, and Harrison defeats Van Buren. And Jacksonian democracy in the Jacksonian era technically is over in 1840. All right, we'll stop there. Okay, on Wednesday, now that Jacksonian America is technically over, we're going to shift gears. I'm going to go back and talk to you about we're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution a little bit, and on Wednesday we'll talk about that, and then we're going to move forward and start talking about really the seeds of abolitionism and the anti-slavery movement, and what really slave life was like in the Old South. And that, like I told you guys, is going to be really important. All right, see you guys.